So, yeah, okay. So I want to begin with a discipline Lily and I are just learning to acknowledge ancestors and to do that in relationship, especially to place here at Wawiatanong and Anishinaabe Ojibwe speak. And that encompasses a whole group, diverse group of indigenous and native peoples as listed, but also to acknowledge the Aita people back in the Philippines and Lily's neck of the woods there in Luzon, my own Indo-European ancestry going way back, probably even to the Huns in Central Asia, where a lot of the German people came from. And indeed, the deep ancestry of all of us, as best we understand, coming out of Africa. But I also want to, whoops, that's just my, wait a minute, sorry. To say up front that what I'm going to talk about as a white non-Indigenous settler colonist is particularly what I hear Indigenous peoples who are still living close to the land actually say about what it means to live sustainably. I'm somebody who's been involved and will continue to be involved in the immediacy of the demand for political action, pushing back on water shutoffs, or even this last Monday out with a group of people in Campus Martius who are protesting the landing of the World Economic Forum that has been meeting in Davos, Switzerland, now in Detroit, in CompuWare. Dan Gilbert's operation is going to be their convening place. And a bunch of us were out for more than an hour pushing back on that. I will continue to do that. But there's another part of me that asks, what are we really doing at this point on this planet as a species? And I particularly then want to listen to what Indigenous people say. So the title, what Standing Rock Protection adds to or pushes on Extinction Rebellion about. Why protection rather than protest? And a lot of the news media, when Standing Rock was jumping off, talked about it as protest, and they would regularly have to be corrected by actual Standing Rock folks saying, no, we are in relationship with the water, and that is our primary responsibility. We don't understand it just as protection. And it pushes me to think about Ojibwe water walking women who've been circumambulating rather the Great Lakes Basin in recent years, and not too long ago engaged in a walk down the Potomac River, 402 miles from its headwaters in West Virginia to where it empties polluted and degraded into Chesapeake Bay. And they were walking a pail of water down the length, a mile at a time, and interviewed. The interviewer asked, are you trying to raise consciousness about caring for the ecology, for the environment? And they would say, yeah, but that's really a white man's way of thinking about all of this. Our primary concern is to speak to the water. We're taking water where she comes out of the mountain springs down to where she's polluted because we want her to remember herself in her pristine state. And this water that we're carrying is now orphaned. We need to get it back to its mother waters as quickly as possible. Well, that's a way of thinking about the environment that goes far beyond what most of us who are modern know what to do with. To speak to the waters, to be concerned for the water remembering herself. We chalk that up as metaphor. Most Indigenous people that I know do not. And for them, the rituals, the myths, the spirituality involved in speaking with, communicating with the non-human realm is crucial and even the primary thing many of them engage in. And so I want to listen to that and let that address me, halt me, and open me up to a whole different way of thinking about what we as a species are doing. And frankly, up front, it seems a little bit crazy for me to be presenting this kind of thing in the midst of the crises, cascading in on us in this moment. But again, I think it's important that we allow those crises to ask of us the deepest possible question. So I'm listening in particular to people like Martine Pretel, half-native guy that Lily and I have been working with, attending his school for more than 8 years, actually for about 10 years now. People like Winona LaDuke, Vine Deloria, a lawyer, theologian, recently deceased, Dakota origins, and Robin Kimmerer, Potawatomi biologist, whose names I think many of you will know. So that's just background, my own blurb, some of the work I've done writing the books. I don't want to focus on those. I want to go straight to a demarcation of the season that is about to open for us, that is colonial, but carries deep Indigenous memory and understanding up inside it. And I want to spend a moment looking at Guadalupe to Nansen, Our Lady of Guadalupe in Roman Catholic understanding. And I have written a poem a number of years ago that I want to share, and then we'll take off from that into the other places I want to go. Some people would argue that Guadalupe to Nansen is the most widely embraced emblem of ritual spiritual ancestry in the Americas over recent years. That it was intended, I need to shift this a little bit here. Excuse me a minute. Come on, I want you to move. There we go. It's intended in settler colonial Christianity as an icon of conquest, but for almost 500 years now has been adapted, adopted, played, and processed as a sanctuary in plain sight for indigenous, mestizo, renegade celebration, memory, and protest, showing up in huge gatherings such as the one depicted on the left, but also on the back of gang members who otherwise are, socially destructive in many ways, and everything in between. Perhaps the most widely recognized spiritual emblem of our time. So here's the poem. Talking to God inside Guadalupe, diciendo adiós dentro la Virgen de Tepeyac. When you came to this new world, writhing in text of tongue or wafer-thin prison of bread, manacled and mangled, the wisp of a wasp fear of ever-stinging omnipotence, organizing arrogance, surrogating succulence, cantilevering white over the land like a death shroud, reducing pot latch to pot ash, burning the sand with conquest. Did you decide to cut loose the pride of the male anatomical lie of supremacy and do drag? Did you slide into a ride of dress, full-bellied with birth, black sash dash of protected motherhood, orbiting the stars like a halo, crowning the cosmos with a heel, raining like a flame of purple on the back of the devil, syncopating earth mother goddess with virgin Madonna redemptrix, full of sleight of hand and tricks? Did you hide inside a Tenansan mound of native meaning like a Tolteca breast giving Dominical milk, like a man donning garb of lace to priest the place with the race of a ghost of female dove? Did you leave behind the offered host, make the most of the toast of the Azteca roast of corn flesh? Did you confess in Creole tongue like a sun eclipse for a short hour in a blood moon? A savior gone native in an image, a primitive scrimmage of culture struggles? Did Jesus tease us in Western efflorescence of mother truss, appearing like a queen of revelation to tantalize the untaught, who would be terrified if the father should arrive uncontrived and naked and debride the red-brown skin without surreptition? Or was this just you finally appearing as you, and Jesus was actually the drag? So the events that give rise to Guadalupanismo in Mexico, roughly, brief outline. 1915, Cortez arrives on the east coast of Mexico. By 1521, Tenochtitlan is destroyed. Rugged time for the remaining folk who are colonized, who are dying of disease, who in some cases are choosing not to have kids or committing suicide. And then in 1531, starting on December 9th, tomorrow, for the next 4 days, Juan Diego, talking eagle, or Cotlatawatzi, as his name was known, and among his own people, receives 4 apparitions of Guadalupe Tonantzin when walking by Cerro del Tepeyac, a local hill, sending him to the Archbishop requesting a chapel to Our Lady of Guadalupe to be built on Tepeyac. He in first encounters singing. The apparition speaks in Nahuatl, his own native tongue. And on the last encounter, she has him go gather up roses where they don't grow in December on the top of that hill and go to the Archbishop. And then, as we'll see in just a minute, there's an image that appears on his tilma, his maguey plant coat, that opened a door to a mestizaje future, opened a door to a possibility of combining cultures and surviving in spite of all the colonial down-pressing violence and early death. And so Our Lady of Guadalupe gets taken up then as an emblem in various socio-political movements ever since. Here's an image of the encounter, Western artist, obviously. I'm interested in the layers that are up inside this emblem now. Most immediately, certainly, Spanish conquistadores, who may well have brought an image of Guadalupe. Show you back up here. Here is a kind of Black Madonna from that monastery in 14th century Spain that is the most immediate possibility for where the image came from, whether it was painted on the cloak or some kind of miraculous apparition. Not trying to address that. Is trying to address the fact that you do have this image and it has a deep history. Coming from Extremadura, Spain, where the statue of the Black Madonna that I just showed you was discovered apparently by a shepherd on the banks of the Guadalupe River, Arabic Wadal River, Latin lupus for wolves, where a Black Madonna statue apparently was buried in 714 to hide it from the Moors. Underneath that, you have Criollo presence, where Guadalupe gets taken up in their 1821 nationalist project to liberate themselves from Spain. Criollos being pure blood, supposedly Spanish, who are nonetheless now living full-time and forever after in Mexico, Mexica people. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Under that, mestizos, La Raza, the group of folk who are dealing with the mixture, looked down upon by criollos as well as Spanish nationals, who nonetheless find sanctuary in La Morenita, the little black one, as they name her, a virgin that is part of this deep tradition going back to Europe of a Madonna of color. And then under that, Indios, Nahuatl-speaking Anahuac peoples, Aztecas, Toltecas, loading in memory and practices of Tonantzin, Coatlicue, Coatlopu, that sounds Guadalupe, almost like Guadalupe. Gloria Anzaldúa, a Latinx feminist writer, runs through some of the possible derivation of the names, the one who is at one with the beasts, coatl being a word for serpent, or rather coat, and the apparition being potentially she of the serpent skirt. Other etymologies, as already mentioned, perhaps combining a Moorish Arabic word and a Latin word, or perhaps Arabic straight up, Guadalupe as a Rio Oculto, a shaded river, a river descending through the craggy heights. All of that up in there. And then back behind that, stone figure of Tonantzin found at now in museum in Mexico City, representing indigenous practices on Tepeyac Hill before the Spanish showed up. Tepeyac Hill today, a representation of what it looked like in the 1600s as well as today. Other names appended to Tonantzin coming along with her: Earth Mother, Goddess of Sustenance, Honored Grandmother, Snake, Bringer of Maize, Mother of Corn, Seven Flower, and Emerald Jade Woman. So all this deep indigenous stuff that's up in there. And although a lot of the image is Spanish conquistadore, there are other things, other elements of that image that are keeping alive an indigenous understanding, including a small little representation just under the black sash on her belly of a four-petaled flower that speaks to the four cardinal directions, the four winds, the sacred number 4 of the Aztecas, and in the center, a fifth element, giving it balance and equilibrium that may be remembering the birth of the fifth sun, which was the understanding in Azteca prophecy of what they were walking through in the colonial experience. And the image as it appears on the revolutionary banner carried by Miguel Hidalgo and his insurgent army during the Independence War. So what we have then is Guadalupe Tonantzin, a site of ancestral surreptition, hiding in plain sight, and political struggle, metabolizing, composting the colonialism out of which she emerges as this composite figure. An 8th century Celt-Iberian, Arabo-Maghrebian, Visigothic, Latin, and Judaic pastoral nomad riverine wolf fetish amulet from the outback of early medieval Spain. And back in Spain, all of those different ethnic mixtures are involved in what's going on in that part of Spain at that time. Functioning as a watershed toponym, referencing a deep-cut mountain wadi, a Rio Oculto, far removed from urbanized imperial violence, yes, taken up in settler colonial Christian Black Madonna promulgation to pacify New World indigenous folk, but loaded with local Mexican Earth Mother upland memory, anchoring notions of the big eco-weather water mystery at once, moon eclipse of the sun, and also rebirth of the Azteca 6th sun, opening a different way forward, rooted in typical September flooding in that valley around Tenochtitlan, Mexico City today. Out of place, out of season December flowering, and the role of agave maguey plant beings in enabling human life in a highland desert, the coat out of which Juan Diego makes his coat, his tilma. It's taken up as an organizing emblem in service of political movements. Liberatory, 1821, revolutionary, 1910, Zapata, giving rise now late in the century to the Zapatistas, and migrant working class efforts, the farm workers movement, Chavez leading such. So that's all just sort of recognizing a moment in the calendar, not so much part of Michigan lore, although Southwest Detroit certainly would be paying attention to that. And that up inside that image are layers and layers, and it's digging through those layers that I'm going to be doing in other ways throughout the rest of what I have to say. So big picture concern to start with, to now shift gears and go where I'm going to go with the talk. Where are we today? This is all just my attempt to organize my thinking, my perception, my action, my artistry, and my educating. We're in a social media AI algorithmic authoritarian debacle, I think. Stephen Hawking, before dying recently, talked about being afraid of climate change and being more afraid of what he saw going on with AI. You know, even this week already, are we going to have killer robots that are by policy championed in the United States, or is there going to be limitations on that? And it looks like we're going forward with that as the new generation of weaponry. A COVID-19 neoliberal globalization climate crisis beleaguered world. Underneath both of those immediate realities, you have Black Lives Matter bringing up onto the surface the white power, white supremacy violence that has been part of this country ever since before the beginnings. 1619 Project also doing a lot of work trying to make that apparent and something we push back on in our discourse. Standing Rock settler colonialism, Christian supremacy in doctrine of Christian discovery, articulations by Native folk saying that even before race discourse emerges, it's really religious discourse that organizes Euro settler taking of the land, a supposed Christian right, that God owns all the land on the planet. So Christian settlers already own the land before they get here. And then indigenous struggle, civilization, species supremacy, going back 5,000 years roughly, where we, for the first time in our elite classes, began to try to elevate ourselves out of reciprocal relationship with the local ecologies we were embedded in as the supreme species, the supreme life form on the planet, which is never proven sustainable anywhere on the planet. Civilization after civilization built on slave labor collapsing. And that's part of what I want to walk through in just a minute. But so I understand climate crisis, where we are now, as the big appearance on the horizon. And I understand it as communication to be heard before its problem to be solved. And it's primarily, in my experience, water speak. The climate shouting at us in floods, or going aloof and withheld in drought and wildfires, precipitating the sixth great extinction, possibility of near-term human extinction. All of that, for me, for Lily, has us putting out on the table all of our assumptions about what life might mean, calling in question the logics we've been operating with. I would understand that the crisis demands radical questioning. Merely tinkering with the machine will not work, although I think a lot of us at some inchoate level hope we can just get back to normal, get over COVID, and keep going with our latte, hot shower, SUV lifestyle without too much interruption. I think we need to grasp the large-scale dynamics engulfing us, to turn, as I listen to Indigenous folk, from future fascination to ancestral wisdom, not focusing on revolution. I don't hear the roughly 350 million Indigenous people on the planet talking primarily about a revolutionary hope, but like the Seven Fires prophecy of the Anishinaabe folk right here, saying we need to recover what we lost. We need to go back to our ancestral ways of wisdom and sustainability. Not that we can absolutely go back, but we need to recover the values and the way of living that they knew about. Not technological fixes, but creative regenerativity. So a book that's just come out in the last year by Elizabeth Colbert called Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. Colbert, a journalist who's trying to track a lot of contemporary issues. The book is basically tracking the history of our technological interventions into the surface of the planet, trying to make life better for us, and then trying to make life better for all the damage we've caused. And she's saying, actually, the history of our technology is a history of failure after failure after failure in terms of anything sustainable. But now we're probably backed into a corner where we've got to radically rely on technology to try to overcome the technology that we've already used to damage and back ourselves into the corner with. We're in a catch-22 from her point of view. And geoengineering of the sky with sulfur dioxide is probably the only way forward. More and more scientists saying that. The only way we have a prospect of surviving. So human beings who will never again see a blue sky as the prospect of hope from a technological point of view. That's not viable to me. So climate crisis is a question, primary question a biosphere is addressing to us. What does it mean to be human? Are we hardwired to destroy ourselves and our living places? Can I live where I am without enslaving other humans or non-humans? Or am I dependent on a system that has to aggress on other places and people? Can I live in my watershed in perpetuity without taking from elsewhere? So Aboriginal folk in Australia living there for 55,000 years, didn't have to import anything, didn't destroy a very harsh, severe landscape, figured out how to listen to that landscape and the elders, plants and animals already there, and learn from them how to live, and doing just fine, thank you. Europeans arrived in the late 18th century, early 19th century. No Europeans been able to live there for more than a few months without having to import stuff from elsewhere. Will the real human being please stand up? If a electromagnetic pulsed weapon was set off 20 miles up in the atmosphere tonight that fried all the electronics, left everything living, still living, what would happen? What would happen is 99% of us would be dead within a couple months because we don't know how to live right where we are without this industrialized apparatus that is all about mining and taking up, stealing, plundering, engineering, slicing, dicing, everything on the face of the planet for our lifestyle. And I'm part of that, I confess. I don't know how to live right where I am. But for me anymore, that is the question. And it's indigenous people who know how to do such a thing, historically. So living justly and sustainably, neologism I invented, but I don't particularly like, so don't use it, sustainability. What's the appropriate unit for thinking human being? For me, it means living in place. Place equals watershed, bioregion, local ecosystem, and mutuality, not the nation state, not the individual of neoliberal globalization, but a local terrain that has been organized in the evolutionary history of the planet by water, leveraging the biodiversity that allows everything to flourish, that changes over time, but has been roughly workable most places on the planet for the last 500 million years until recently. So two values, justice and sustainability. Justice in our relationships with each other, sustainability in the human, non-human relationship as the values that I'm interested in. And then the question, have we ever lived relatively justly and sustainably, that is, in place? And the answer is yes. And then it goes to my graph that I typically teach with in every course that I teach anywhere. And I used, I think last time, I gave a talk here for my visual comprehension outlining the big history of the planet, where for the last 5,000 years, we've increasingly been organized in city-state systems committed to coerced labor, surplus product, taxation, conscription, irrigation, re-engineering of all kinds, walls, writing, and war, rolling across the planet, gathering up every other way of living into itself and forcing conformity. And as I say, we call this civilization. And more than 200 of civilizations have collapsed in this 5,000-year history. Nowhere been sustainable. Before that, we live most of our time on the planet as hunting and gathering folk in band societies of 150 or less. About 10,000 years ago, beginning to experiment with domestication of plants and animals, agriculture, but still sustainable, combining subsistence agriculture, pastoralism. Whoops, and I lost the hunting and gathering reference that should be there. In a flexible mix where people are not living hierarchically, everybody's living at roughly the same level. Some experimentation, around 4000 BCE, even in ceremonial city centers, 10,000 people maybe living together, or at least seasonally coming together. But the archaeology is, again, that everybody's living the same way everybody else is. And then, for all kinds of reasons we don't fully understand, climate change maybe being part of them, a drought in Mesopotamia, we cross this threshold into this other modality that we now call civilization, that most of us are shaped into and entirely committed to and believe it's the only way to be human, except it's nowhere worked. And then also the fact that in the history, once this got rolling, people were constantly revolting, particularly taking their herd animals as part of an agricultural animal husbandry economy called a city-state system, taking their herd animals, going out and not coming back, and the animals integrating them back into a more sustainable way of living. Pastoral nomadism can go imperial as well, and does in the Mongols, for instance. But initially, it often was a return to something much more sustainable and symbiotic. So that's the picture I try to hold in my head all the time when I'm trying to figure out what to do. What am I aiming at? What do I really believe is worth struggling for? Just to give picturesque emblem to all of that, a wild mountain, a cloud descending, water falling, streams becoming rivers going back to the ocean on the Levantine coast way back 5,000 years ago, versus what begins to appear between the rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, artificial mountains, ziggurats, towers, created landscapes presided over by elites that are re-engineering the landscape to serve themselves, convinced they're supreme. Another emblematic depiction of the difference, a water course being allowed to serpentine fashion amble across the land versus an irrigation system that begins to control water and ultimately now in our day bottle it and commodify it like everything else. So the alternative way of living sustainably is typically talked about in anthropological circles as a kind of gift economy reciprocity. And in many of those systems, there was a sort of keystone species human hybrid animal that lived in a local ecosystem. It might be a salmon human, the Haida, Heltsuk, Northwest Pacific, whale humans, Inuit, Nupiaq, Eskimo, buffalo humans, Lakota, cattle humans, etc. Maize humans, agave humans. It can be plant, it can be animal. A symbiosis between the human community locally and that other life form in that watershed that enables life to continue generation after generation. And so with that in my mind, I sort of go back down the history of sustainability to say this settled monocrop agricultural city-state thing has not been sustainable. These other ways of living are the ways so far in our history on the planet that have been. Four kind of models that come out of that are often combined with each other. They're not pure, but they're a way for me to try to think clearly about where I am, again, what I'm aiming at, what has worked, what has not worked. Using the word indigenous, which I use constantly, so does Lily, I would consider to be indigenous the hunting and gathering lifestyle, low-tech subsistence agriculture, combined often with pastoralism, again, low-tech, small scale, and to some degree, pastoral nomadism, folk who revolted from the city-state systems, took their herd animals and began to wander on the Sea of Grass in Asia, or in desert domains with camels in the Mideast and North Africa, Berber folk, Bedouin folk. Non-indigenous, counter-indigenous lifestyles, again, this settled monocrop agricultural city-state thing. Emphasis on the word indigenous as I use it. Four Arrows is a friend, a colleague of Lily's, Native American guy, part Native American, part white, who delineates three different uses of the term in the way he talks about it as an anchor for decolonization initiatives. What are we decolonizing toward? Who are we listening to? Whose concerns do we want to honor? A second level for him is the prioritization of local place-based indigenous wisdom. Local communities that develop their language, their rituals, their self-understanding in relationship to a given ecology. And that'll look very different depending on the ecology. And then a sort of pan-indigenization level of using the word that recognizes what's in common in lifestyle options between these different, very locally based indigenous ecosystem symbioses all across the planet. My use of the term is informed by Four Arrows' way of talking about it. I'm interested not so much in a bloodline, but in a relatively intact ancestral lifestyle, which means in place. I want to use the word to reference people who know how to live right where they are generation after generation in a way that allows other beings to flourish there as well as themselves. I know use of the word indigenous is very embattled now, and I could be charged with appropriating. So a different language I try to come up with is maybe the word land taught. Winona LaDuke was recently in an interview with a bunch of folk who were pushing for a return to the commons, and one of the white guys she was talking with was saying, well, we got to get back to the commons. The commons belongs to all of us. And LaDuke intervened and said, no, from our point of view, White Earth Anishinaabe up in northern Minnesota, the planet does not belong to us. The earth does not belong to us. The land we dwell on does not belong to us. We belong to it. And it's not an it, it's our mother. How can we maintain a relationship? How do we get into the kind of relationship where the land claims us as its offspring? Was her entire concern in that ongoing conversation. So what does it take to be land taught, to live sustainably in place? Baba Dioum, a Senegalese environmentalist, talks about we can't care for a place if we don't love the place. We can't love the place if we don't know the place, and we can't know the place if we don't learn it. It means approaching the place creatures to hear the place speak. Plants, animals, waters, weather, soil, seasons, speaking to us. Codifying the place culturally and spiritually in mythic stories and rituals. I'll say more about that in a minute. Telling the stories, enacting rituals, placing us in reciprocity or otherwise. And one major effect of stories placing us in reciprocity is limitation. That would be another way for me of articulating the primary message we are being faced with by the biosphere at this point in time. Can we limit ourselves? If we can't, we're gone, because the biosphere will limit us. But we need to begin with the stories that already inhabit us, because most of us aren't living this kind of story ritual relationship with a local ecosystem. What stories already have it? Well, the big planetary story, I think we have to come to grips with that, be aware of it. The entire history that we call history, meaning writing, people who wrote what they were doing, civilization, work our way down that, get beyond that to, story from the last ice age up until civilization, so roughly 18,000 BCE to 3,200 BCE or so. The story of the human species before that, going back 3 million years, the story of the Earth before that, 4.4 billion years, the story of the universe, 3.8 billion years up to the present. At some level today, I think we have to pay attention to all of that to know what it means to be human and to begin to address how to live sustainably. More immediately, the colonial story of the land and this place, right where we are, right here, from the point of view of an original indigenous inhabitants. And that plunges us into coming to grips with the doctrine of Christian discovery that I mentioned earlier. For me, particularly Stephen Newcomb, Lenape scholar, legal scholar, Pagans in the Promised Land, in which he outlines the way in which, as I mentioned earlier, it was really the Christian identity and Christianity as a signifier that leveraged Euro-colonial relationship to the land, gave rise to all the others: discovery, domination, ownership, title, and so on. But it was referencing papal bulls going back even to the Middle Ages, in effect saying God owns the earth, God's representatives on earth then own the earth in the name of God. Therefore, Christian kings and queens of European powers, when they come over to the Americas, already own the land here so long as it's not claimed by another Christian power. And Newcomb outlines the way that gets embedded in our legal system, the Christian signifier erased, but very much still there as the primary rationale for why any of us have title to the property under our feet. The very idea of title dependent on that. So for Newcomb, it's a matter of having to go back down through all of that and recognize the fiction that this country is absolutely built on, a Christian fiction of supremacy. Some of the language used, not going to spend time with that. We need to wrap up here pretty quickly. So for me, then here, digging into the colonial story in this place, Wawiatanong, schooling the not yet human. The not yet human is me, since I don't know how to live here in a way that's human. I'm dependent on this industrialized apparatus plundering other people as well as people here to leverage my breath and my being able to be alive. 21st century, water and air being commodified. Century of water wars. Last century, century of oil wars. This century already clear. We're headed into a century where we're going to, in fact, Syria probably to some degree 10 years ago was the beginning of the kind of water wars that are going to emerge all over the planet. Last century, iron and fossil fuel being commodified. Before that, 19th century, timber and land being commodified and owned, put up for sale in the market. Before that, beaver and wampum, the kind of mega shells that the Anishinaabe folk looked at as their spiritual teachers in their pilgrimage from the East Coast prior to colonial contact to the western edge of Lake Superior. What does all of that look like from a visual perspective? Out on the plains, most of us have probably seen this image before, buffalo skulls, where European colonizers recognized early on that they weren't doing too well in trying to get rid of native folk out there, Europeans quickly deciding that what they wanted from native folk was disappearance, what they wanted from African folk was appearance, to be able to incarcerate Black folk in their skin as a sign of their enslavability. But with native folk, it was disappearance. So they just wanted natives gone. Weren't doing too well, and then said, you know, native folk on the plains live in this symbiosis with buffalo. The way to get rid of the native folk is get rid of the buffalo. So wholesale massacre of the buffalo, and then gloating by standing on top of the skulls. Probably not many of us know, a lot of those skulls in 1892 are being processed industrial right here in Michigan. Another version of the same thing in Michigan is timber. In the 19th century, it was especially taking over, dominating, cutting, re-engineering timber into housing. That was at the heart of the colonial enterprise. And then on top of that, mussels, giving us our buttons, to the point where we have almost eliminated mussels in our lakes and rivers in Michigan. Same kind of image, gloating, standing dominant on top of this natural resource that you've decimated, you control, and made over in your image. My story, part of all of this, how do I dig into what I'm doing here? So for me, it's been a matter of being schooled by Black culture, reschooled by Filipino culture, not knowing anything when I met Lily in 2001 about US-Filipino colonial relations, where we decimated as much of as a sixth of the population of the Philippines in the process of pacifying it. Had to get up to speed on that quickly. With her, facing into the settler colonialism right here, which I've already been rehearsing, and then listening to that, to what Indigenous people say, bothering to actually start to learn, how do I listen to the non-human world? How do I recover relationship with them in a way where they can speak to me, teach me? So visually looks like that. Means coming to grips with the land zone story. How do we hear the land story? Yes, listen to science, but even more, listening to the people who have a track record of living in place in such a way that the land flourishes across generations, which is to say land-taught people or indigenous people, and thus mythic storytelling and ritual care. Mythic storytelling, a way most indigenous cultures across the planet have narrated their presence in a local ecology, is different from straight up narrative. The story is understood as a living creature that typically wants to come out only at night around a fire in a community that is fed and is going to be put to sleep slowly by the story under an open sky where the stars are also creatures that are present. It's structured middle, end, beginning, middle. So there's no resolution. You begin in mess. There's a partial resolution of the mess, a regeneration, and then back in the mess. It's not a story that promises heaven. It's a story that makes sense of the pain of here and now in a way that gives it beauty. Non-verb to be languages that are based on not being able to say this is that or that is, I'm not saying that well. Jim is a human being and not a squirrel. The tree is part of a forest and not part of a river. Drawing boundaries between things, marking things out as discrete from each other. Many indigenous languages can't do that. All you can say is humanness belongs to Jim. Treeness belongs to the tree, but squirrelness may also belong to the tree. In fact, squirrelness may also belong to Jim in that kind of language. It doesn't draw those sorts of boundaries, but actually holds a complex, multifaceted, paradoxical reality in its expression and keeps the human community living into that. It's also used for initiation purposes. I'm not sure I'm going to have time to talk about that because I got to wrap up really quickly here. although there's a key idea up in there, taking youth when the hormones kick in, pulling them away from their programming and deprogramming them in a sense, and often having at the heart of it an encounter with their own mortality, ritually and mythically, where they have to sort of fight with their own death by creating enough beauty that death says, okay, I'll let you live for a while if you will agree to accept your death at the right moment. You've created enough beauty. I'm intrigued by that. Maybe you can go on and create beauty for a while, but when the day comes for you to die, you need to say yes to it and not fight it. That's very different than how we do education. That mythic storytelling to some degree recapitulates in narrative structure what is true of the physical universe. For instance, neurotransmitters up in our brains are molecules that flip between two conformations, two very different shapes, depending on their chemical and electrical environments. They're designed, meaning they evolved to be unreliable in the sense they jump with maximal ease between the two conformations. They exist in the brain in a superposition state, atoms that are in two places at once. Their state's a mixture of two conformations in a way that makes no sense to our intuitions that are attuned to macroscopic reality. Or at another level, wave and particle realities that seem to be true of most of what we call matter. Science increasingly starting to allow for the possibilities that consciousness may be part of matter all the way up and down the structure of the physical universe, not consciousness like human beings, but consciousness nonetheless. And things like a slime mold now being discovered to make decisions, perceive its surroundings, choosing the most nutritious food from numerous options, or even organelles, mitochondrial, the organelle is found in the cells of almost every complex organism, exhibiting some of that kind of behavior. So skipping through this, and I have skipped through that, the other part of the indigenous way of relating to place, telling mythic stories, and ritual care. And this is the hardest thing for me as a modern person. We continuously take and tear a hole in the fabric of reality simply by living, eating, drinking, clothing, sheltering, even breathing. What we did not create. We consume the beauty of other beings. We owe for the gifts received. Many indigenous cultures, one way or another, living out their understanding of a kind of original debt. What do we owe? The small things we can do, no other creature can do to give beauty back in a way that doesn't benefit us. Art, but not for the market and not as self-expression and not for us. Make beauty with our tongues. Eloquent recognition and honor-giving praise drove early Euro colonists crazy to meet with native groups, because you take 1 to 3 days just eloquently talking about who you are and about the encounter before you got down to the business of negotiating. Making beauty with our thumbs. Tobacco, beads, monuments. So big question, whoops, out of my encounter, I'm almost done here, with Indigenous is what's the priority? Human survival, getting what I want, the land belongs to us, accumulation, re-engineering, or planetary flourishing, giving back to the rest of life, including my body. We belong to and are taught by the land. We're living gift economy reciprocity, and we're feeding the rest of the world. Historic Indigenous responses championing the latter priority. There's 2 subsidiary questions. How do I hear the land speak? Myth, codifying dream, vision, holistic perception. How do I give back or feed? Ritual offerings. Ritual offerings in the form of beads, probably the oldest form of this on the planet. Native folk around much of the US give tobacco now. Anytime they take anything from the natural world, they remember, we owe, we need to give back. Before that, here and all over the planet, going back as much as 250,000 years, human beings did this. They made, and Lily and I are learning from Martin Krechtel, oops, where am I here? The native guy we regularly write, taking shells, grinding them on rocks, drilling them with flint, and then giving that to wild nature when we take stuff from wild nature. The other way that fascinates me are monoliths, and this is the last thing I'll say. You know, monumental standing stones mythically coordinating the macro beauty of star heroes and ground heroes with human efforts. So you get a place like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, recently discovered in the last 25 years, that is, you know, there are 26 of these monolith circles that are buried in this mound that were built as long ago as 9,300 BCE by hunter-gatherer folk. They didn't live there. The monoliths did nothing for them. They have carvings on them of wild animals in that neighborhood at that time, Southeast Turkey. But what was it for? Why the expenditure, all that effort across multiple generations? And they would apparently use them in the sense of design them, give them, craft them, and then bury them, rebury them. It did nothing for them. It wasn't instrumental. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't for their sake. It was like a big bead given to wild nature as part of their way of giving beauty back for the beauty they took. And that to me is the hardest thing to sort of entertain and receive from indigenous cultures, but I see it all over. And I understand, if I'm serious about reciprocity, I've got to get where I somehow understand I don't just receive gifts from wild nature, I need to give gifts back. So that's the end of it. Thank you for putting up with all that.
Thank you, Jim. It's really a three-part lecture all compressed into one. And so we have a few minutes left for discussion. Do people have reactions, feedback, questions? I know that Shannon has something in the chat. It says, makes me wonder if there is a parallel model of history/evolutionary sustainability for non-human organisms.
Interesting question. Yeah.
Any thoughts in response?
Well, for me, it's a big mystery, this thing called human choice, or what we sometimes call free will. And I know it's debated in philosophical circles whether we're deluding ourselves that we have such today. Do animals, do plants have the capacity to choose? Yeah, it seems they do. And we're increasingly recognizing not just animals, but plants are making choices at some level, that there is a sort of neurostructure, not a brain, but they have the capacity to do this and not that as they engage their environment. Do they have the capacity to destroy their environment? Just reading an article about a particular pear tree that's taking over the Bartlett pear, I think it is, over the south. That's an invasive species where it seems like it is decimating ecosystems. So is that the equivalent of the human species deciding to do this city-state thing 5,000 years ago? I don't know. Maybe.
I would say in the case of the Bartlett pear, people had a lot to do with that.
That people have what?
People had a lot to do with what happened.
Yeah, that's the thing.
I mean, I think you'd have to use a parallel of something that would be in a native environment, and there probably is always that push-pull. I was just curious because,
well, we do.
I'm trying to always remind myself that I'm trying to explain the world from my human perspective versus non-human.
Yeah. The planet did go through 5 big extinctions previously. Wild nature is not afraid to sort of blow the whistle and say, full halt, we're going to start over, reboot.
Just a comment from Rebecca, so much to process here. I feel like I need a whole day.
I'd like to say something or ask something, or
Yeah.
I think a lot about hybridity, and you brought up mestizaje at the beginning. And I actually incorporated the article you had that you'd mentioned in this meeting before about decolonization and running from running to innocence, colonizing innocence. But if you look forward, I mean, Mexico is a perfect example of a society that has this mixture. You know, it is not fully colonial, and it's not fully colonized, right? This is what you're kind of saying with that discussion. It's a hybrid kind of organism. And, you know, thinking to the future, I wonder, and I also assigned Insco's article about how important the imagination is to our future, you know, and I wonder, like, if we are decolonizing, there's a moment where we are kind of a hybrid, right, of our history of colonization, but resisting that colonization. So I think that gives a lot of space for us to think about what that decolonizing hybrid identity might look like. And it might not just be what we had, you know, several thousand years ago. Maybe we can imagine new ways to be on the planet in harmony with, you know, because it seems like when I'm talking to students about decolonization, it always seems like hearkening back to the past. But, you know, that's just not possible in a way. We can't ever be what
Laura, what do you then do with the 7 fires prophecy in Anishinaabe of this very place where you and I live, saying we need to recover,
right,
we need to go back to
right,
what
and I agree, but when we do, will we simply be back in the past again?
I think that's a big unknown. Yeah, for me, it's a matter of letting that call to go back and pick up what was dropped, letting that really have me, right, and push on me, and then learning the details of it. What are the details of what I lost? And that's not a you know, just reading a book. That's a many-year process to really let that word have effect in my body, as I'm discovering. You know, would that I could just get it from a book, but learn, the deeper I go, the more I'm realizing, whoa, this is some deep shit stuff that's different from me.
Yesterday, my child and I.
Is the idea of recover, is that what we would ordinarily think of as the word recover? Because I'm just thinking what Laura is saying might be more like reconstruct.
Or metamorphosis.
Using, like, yeah, using some understanding of the past, but we can't be the past, can we?
Yeah, and for me, the deep question is, how do we understand? It's a good word, I think. It means standing under. How do I give something from the past power over my body, over me, over my efforts, over my energy and my time, that helps me start to understand what it is that I lost, that I don't know how to do?
And I also think about the fact that, you know, the Indigenous elders, they have a lot of knowledge about the land as it was, and that kind of knowledge can change to adapt to climate change. But I think it's all changing, you know?
Yep, for sure.
So as we recover, we have to understand that everything is changing.
Yep.
So it's a kind of a dynamic metamorphosis that requires, like you say, an opening, an immersion. I think it's very, you know, it's very, your talk was very stimulating, definitely.
Okay, thanks.
it's really interesting. It's funny that what it reminded me of at the beginning is I read, have any of you read John Irving's book, Avenue of Mysteries? He's a novelist that you've probably all read some of his books, but it just reminded me, like that book, I appreciated it, but I knew that I didn't understand hardly anything about it.
Yeah.
And have you read it, Jim?
No, I have not, but the feeling you're describing is a feeling I have a lot.
Well, it's funny because you went all the way back, like his name in the book was one, he was from Mexico. He was a kid that grew up in the dump in Mexico. And then he does, as an adult, does a pilgrimage to the Philippines.
Oh.
And but he has this vision of the mother of Guadalupe.
Yeah, Our Lady of Guadalupe.
Our Lady of Guadalupe. And then there's a lot of other stuff in there too that is interesting. But but because I know almost nothing about Catholicism and that history, I enjoyed the story, but I wondered about all that I was missing there. And so I'm still missing a lot. You've given me some sense for at least why some of those people were named in that story the way it was.
Yeah, yeah.
I appreciate the thoughts from Laura and Shannon. Actually, Indigenous peoples have had to do a lot of that amalgamation, and they call it composting, metabolizing, right? It's not, they cannot ever exorcise, like I cannot ever exorcise the influence of colonialism in my psyche. It is there, but what do you do with it? And what is to be the guiding wisdom or logic that will enable you to make something productive out of that history? And like what a lot of Indigenous folks have had to do with Catholicism, with Christianity, right? Some say it's just an exchange of statues from Caucasian-looking, from Anitos, the local gods, with Caucasian-looking statues, but some have really done creative amalgamation, but there are also so many of them that have been completely decimated in terms of their own spirituality taken away. So making it impossible for them, because our verb to be in this European mentality that doesn't allow for that. I think our difficulty in thinking about how to move forward is because we often have to think in terms of either or, right? Is it about going back? Or, we can't ever go back if we're thinking of hunting and gathering, even if we wanted to, because there's just too many of us. And so how do we learn? I think for me, how do we learn from a very different way of being, a very different way of understanding the world, so that we can see what we can do moving forward? Alan.
Yeah, I just want to thank Jim for amazing talk. That was really just amazing. And I'll be thinking about this for weeks to come and reading a lot of the text that you shared with us. And I used the James Scott book, Against the Grain, in one of my classes this term to try to ask some of these questions, but not nearly as eloquently as you did. The one thing that I found is that students have a really difficult time understanding what they've lost when they don't understand what they've lost. For them, it's a matter of discovery, right? But I thought your mentioning of the idea of original debt was just so important to me, because it gives me a way to get into that in a big way by addressing also a competing understanding of original sin, right? I think that's a nice dichotomy to maybe enter that in a way that is very productive, that could be very useful.
Yeah.
And I think I'll be thinking a lot about that in the days to come, how to use that. I think it's a really powerful concept.
Yeah. And, and it's deep, complex. I'm just scratching the surface in my own understanding, because it gets into what we mean by money, by exchange, by barter. So you get David Graeber and David Wengrow's new book, The Dawn of Everything, or Graeber's earlier book, The First 5,000 Years, Debt, A History of Debt, or Michael Hudson, economist, who's been convening ancient Near Eastern scholars during the 90s to try to learn about what happened in those early city-state systems economically, with debt in particular. And debt release, debt cancellation, jubilee, was part of the regular monarchical practice until finally the creditor class won the struggle, so that debt became perpetual. And we shifted from releasing debt being this sacred obligation to paying your debt being promulgated by the creditor and then the political class as your sacred obligation, which is the society we're in today. But it's deep, deep stuff.
Agreed.
And on a spiritual level, I think the idea is not to get out of debt, but to be in this indebted relationship with the natural world. Because even when we give back bead or whatever item we make by hand, we're still taking, even the intelligence, even the eloquence still comes from we didn't make it ourselves, right?
So our first session with Prechtel in his school, we had to bring shells and rocks and flint from our area of the country. And then in our hands-on time, we learned how to drill, how to make the beads. And he'd say, and it takes you, anywhere from 2 to 5 hours to make a bead. So we learn how to make a bead, and then he'd say, okay, now you owe a bead for the shell that you took to make the bead out of it in the first place. And then you owe another bead for the rock that you took to grind the shell. And then you owe another bead for the flint that you took to drill the bead. So you're always in the hole, which was the point of it. But his way of teaching that was to make us have to do it. So we start to understand it in our bodies, not just as a concept, but as hands that are now blistered from grinding this stuff and covered with the chalk dust, barite or aragonite or calcite dust of the shell, and so on. And it really hits home then.
And to the extent that civilization is about trying to not be indebted, trying not to be in relationship with the natural world, I think that is what is doing us in. Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much, Jim. And thank you, everybody. We're going to post the recording somewhere. Thank you, Scott. Okay.
Thank you, Jim and Lily.
Thank you.
Yeah,
See everybody.
Awesome.
Okay.
Say
Happy holidays.
I hope for the steering committee, I wonder if we can have a get together for the before heading out. What do you think?
Maybe we could have that kind of meal. I heard a talk about somewhere where you have 6-foot long spoons and forks and sit around a big table feeding each other across the table.
I would love to do something before I leave, but I don't think it's going to be possible. But